I wanted to find the right settings for single player Ark and took inspiration from this Reddit post. These are the settings that work for me. In single player, the only danger is coming from wild creatures and bosses. For that reason, the difficulty level is put to the normal maximum and the player resistance is increased to 1.25. Experienced players can increase that number even further to increase the damage taken. The experience multiplier is set to 10 to decrease the amount of unnecessary crafting sessions, and the taming speed is increased to 6 because there's no additional danger while taming wild creatures if the player uses taming pens and barricades. The harvesting damage of dinos is increased to 3 to give an incentive for the player to tame and use creatures. Harvest amount increased to 4 results in more resources gathered by each harvesting activity. To put more focus on dinos, the food drain is increased, meaning creatures get hungry faster, which also indirectly reduces the total amount of time needed for taming wild creatures. Since the normal health recovery of dinos is way too slow, a setting of 2 increases the recovery rate to a more fitting level. This setting can be increased further without breaking that recovery rate. To limit the grind during early game, the harvest damage inflicted by the player is increased to 1.5. I recommend caution with this one to keep the utility of harvesting creatures and not overpower the player. If you want to increase the difficulty in certain situations, you can disable the third-person camera and the crosshair, as well as the corpse locator. Check the maximum difficulty box to force the maximum level of wild creatures to level 150. If you want to build more freely, also check the structure placement collision to make sure the terrain won't be a problem at certain parts of maps. If you want to build multiple floors on platform saddles, check the according box, as well as the leveling of movement speed on flying creatures. If you increase the amount of engram points gained per level, you don't need unlimited respecs, as this feature is primarily focused on promoting cooperative gameplay in multiplayer. In the Advanced tab, make sure to double check every setting correlating with multiplayer or simply copy my settings for the most unrestricted gameplay. Diseases offer a new level of danger that increases in multiplayer conflicts. Therefore, I recommend to disable permanent diseases, but not to prevent diseases entirely. If you want spikes and turrets on platform saddles, check the structure platform box. Ignore the first 5 sliders managing PvP settings and adjust the radius in which resources can respawn around structures. There's a second setting later on and it is not clear how these two correlate, but I recommend a setting of 0.7 for this one. Lower values could make resources respawn that clip into houses or bases. In the world settings section, you could disable the imprint buff on baby dinos, making breeded creatures less strong. A lower poop interval decreases the times a player has to poop, but setting it to 0 makes everyone poop all the time. It's great if you need a lot of fertilizer. The lower the lay egg interval, the more often a creature lays an egg, although a setting of 0.3 is still not as often as one would expect. I recommend everyone to think about the next bunch of settings, as these completely alter the experience while breeding creatures. I decreased the waiting time between mating to 0.005. This makes tech parasauruses, for example, able to mate every 11 minutes. The hatching speed for fertilized eggs is increased to 15, but this setting is irrelevant if you use a mod like Structures Plus or Superstructures with a hatchery. I increased the speed at which baby dinosaurs mature to 500. This makes wyvern babies mature to full size in roughly 13 minutes from hatching. Adjust these settings to your liking if you want to spend more or even less time maturing baby creatures. The harvest health is increased to 6 to make resource nodes even more valuable and decrease the amount of time needed grinding resources. The time it takes resources to respawn is decreased to 0.6. This feels like a good sweet spot for me, but I recommend testing this for yourself, as this is quite fast for trees and bushes. Back to baby creatures, I decreased the amount of time a baby creature wants attention to cope with the increased maturation speed. A setting of 0.017 makes a baby wyvern need care after 7 minutes, and the next 3 settings make sure that successfully caring for that baby one time results in a 100% imprint. Once again, if you want to spend more time caring for baby dinos and make a max imprint more special, adjust these settings to your liking. I left the time settings as they were, as the nighttime usually brings its own set of challenges, and that's the right choice of danger I wanted to put into single player. I increased the spoiling time on all items as well as the corpse decomposition time to give the player enough time in early game to gather all needed resources. The radius the player and structures prevent resources from respawning is decreased, and this is the second time there is a structure setting, although I recommend an even lower level for this one. A level of 0 would make resources respawn regardless of any structures or the player. The speed at which crops grow needs to be increased, as the vanilla settings would call for 24 hours for maturing a potato plant, for example. A speed of 4 seems to be a sweet spot, as it makes a greenhouse quite valuable but not necessary. Crop decay speed increases the time until crops decay in a crop plot. In the next sections I recommend to nerf tamed creatures and buff wild creatures to keep a sense of danger from wild creatures and not overpower any tamed and breeded creature. I increased the weight stats slightly to make creatures carry more and increased the movement speed slightly to make specs into that stat even more worthwhile. The player stats can be adjusted to your liking, but I increased the stamina and movement speed gain per level as well as significantly increased the weight spec. I would recommend a decrease in health and damage for the player to further increase the danger by creatures, but only if you are an experienced player. The experience multipliers change the experience gained by certain actions, and I like these settings to emphasize on combat and crafting. In the miscellaneous section you can change the amount of experience points that can be stored for players and dinos. I did not set a maximum, as it would only increase the time spent farming experience, and yeah, I don't really see a point. The next boxes can mostly be checked, except the one showing the floating damage that pops up when a player or creature inflicts damage. This might break the immersion if you aim for a more realistic game without crosshairs, for example. Certain creatures are only tameable for a short amount of time, like the Titanosaurus, which will simply refuse to eat anything and slowly starve if this box is not checked. To balance the raw power of those raid dinos, a higher food drain is recommended. The crafting skill multiplier is a bit of a weird one, as I cannot seem to see any difference regardless of the setting. The loot quality from supply crates as well as fishing is quite low on normal settings, and I feel these need to be improved for single player or PvE. Fuel won't be a problem with our harvesting settings, that's why I recommend an increase for this setting. The structure limit just makes sure you won't hit a limit while building large bases or just multiple bases. The last thing you can change is the active event, where you can manually start an event like the Easter or Christmas one, but only if the event is running on official servers, as otherwise your game won't have the necessary files to make them work. If you want to see all of these settings in action, check out my single player series or subscribe for more content like this. A link to my Reddit post is in the comment section, where you can find instructions on how to change the engram points gained per level, and make sure to leave a like and a comment for the algorithm, and as always, stay safe out there.